The Epstein Files. What if the real scandal isn't Epstein? The story that refuses to die. What if one of the most controversial scandals in modern American history was never really about Jeffrey Epstein? What if the real story is something far bigger, something that reaches beyond one man, beyond one criminal network, beyond even the crimes themselves? Because right now, a scandal many believed was buried is roaring back to life. Congress is reopening questions, witnesses are being called, lawmakers are demanding answers, and perhaps most importantly, Americans are once again asking whether powerful institutions told them the whole truth. But here's what makes this story so dangerous. The longer it continues, the less it becomes a story about Epstein, and the more it becomes a story about trust. Trust in government, trust in law enforcement, trust in the institutions that claim to protect the public. And that may be the most explosive revelation of all.
I am Willmax Kenzy, and this is GEO-X, where the future of the world is being decided. Strategic Pillar 1. The files that were never supposed to matter again. For years, many believed the Epstein story was over. The arrests had happened, the headlines had faded, the public had moved on. Or so it seemed. But history has a habit of returning when important questions remain unanswered. And in this case, those questions never disappeared. Because despite repeated assurances that little remained to investigate, new information kept emerging. Documents surfaced, emails surfaced, witnesses resurfaced, and suddenly a troubling possibility emerged. What if investigators knew more than they originally revealed? What if potential leads were never fully pursued? And what if some of the most important witnesses had never been forced to publicly answer difficult questions? These questions are now driving a new phase of scrutiny, not because the scandal is new, but because the doubts never disappeared. But if the story was supposedly finished, why is Congress suddenly interested again? The answer begins with one woman, and her name appears throughout the evidence more than almost anyone else. Strategic Pillar 2. The woman at the center of the storm. For nearly 2 decades, Leslie Groff worked at Jeffrey Epstein's side. Not as a casual employee, not as an occasional assistant, but as someone deeply involved in the daily operation of his life. Scheduling, communication, travel, meetings, contacts. The very mechanisms through which powerful people interacted with Epstein. This is why lawmakers wanted to hear from her, because proximity matters, and few people were closer. Now, Groff insists she was unaware of criminal activity. She describes Epstein as a master manipulator, a man who separated his public life from his private conduct, a man who allegedly deceived even those around him. But not everyone accepts that explanation. Some survivors dispute it, some investigators question it, and some lawmakers openly doubt it. Because the closer one examines the records, the harder some people find it to believe that so much could remain invisible. And this is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because the debate is no longer about what happened. It is about who knew, when they knew, and whether they chose not to see it. Strategic Pillar 3. The question of willful blindness. In criminal investigations, there is a concept known as willful blindness. Not necessarily knowing, but avoiding knowing, not asking questions, not looking too closely, not investigating what might be uncomfortable to discover. This concept is now becoming central to the discussion because some lawmakers believe Groff's testimony raises more questions than answers. Could someone spend nearly 20 years inside Epstein's world and see nothing unusual?
Could someone coordinate meetings, schedules, payments, and travel without recognizing warning signs? Or is the real issue not what people knew, but what they were willing to acknowledge? These are difficult questions, and they extend far beyond one witness, because every major scandal eventually confronts the same issue. How many people saw fragments of the truth, and how many convinced themselves there was nothing to see? GEO-X Interim Conclusion. At first glance, this appears to be a story about testimony, a story about documents, a story about one witness. But beneath the surface, a larger question is emerging, a question about accountability, a question about institutional transparency, and a question about whether powerful systems sometimes protect themselves before they protect the truth. And that may be why this story refuses to disappear. Because Americans are no longer asking only what Jeffrey Epstein did. They are asking something much bigger. Who knew? Who looked away? And why did it take so long to get answers? In Part 2, we investigate the most important question of all. What happens when citizens begin to lose confidence in the institutions meant to deliver justice? And why some experts believe that question could have consequences far beyond the Epstein case itself. I am Willmax Kenzy, and this is GEO-X, where the future of the world is being decided. If you're still watching, type truth in the comments. Like this video. Subscribe to GEO-X. Join us for the Part 2, because the biggest revelation may not be about Epstein at all. The Epstein Files. What if the real scandal isn't Epstein? Stay for the Part 2, when trust becomes the real victim. What if the most damaging consequence of the Epstein scandal is not what happened inside Jeffrey Epstein's world, but what happened inside America's institutions? Because every nation depends on something more important than money, more important than military power, more important than politics. Trust. Trust that laws apply equally. Trust that investigations follow evidence. Trust that justice is not reserved for the powerless. And when that trust begins to crack, the consequences can spread far beyond a courtroom. Today, the Epstein story is no longer simply about a criminal network. It is becoming a test of institutional credibility, and that may be the most dangerous development of all. I am Willmax Kenzy, and this is GEO-X, where the future of the world is being decided. Geopolitical Stake 1. The Crisis of Confidence. Throughout history, great powers have survived wars, economic crises, political scandals, even periods of social unrest. But there is one challenge every major power struggles to survive: the collapse of public confidence. Because institutions do not function merely through authority, they function through legitimacy. Citizens obey laws because they believe those laws are applied fairly. Voters participate because they believe their voices matter. Communities cooperate because they believe justice exists. But what happens when people begin to question those assumptions? What happens when every new revelation creates more questions
than answers. That is the danger surrounding the Epstein files. The issue is no longer only what occurred. The issue is whether the public believes the full truth was ever pursued. And once that doubt takes root, it becomes very difficult to remove. But trust is not the only thing at stake, because every major institution now faces a question that grows more uncomfortable with every new revelation. What did they know, and when did they know it? Geopolitical Stake 2: The Power of Information. Information has always been one of the most valuable forms of power. Empires have risen because they controlled information. Governments have fallen because information escaped their control. And scandals become dangerous not simply because of what they reveal, but because of what they suggest remains hidden. This is why the Epstein files continue generating attention. Every released document creates a new question. Every witness statement creates a new contradiction. Every contradiction creates new demands for transparency. And transparency creates pressure. Pressure on agencies, pressure on officials, pressure on political leaders. Because once people suspect that information was withheld, they begin asking whether there's more still hidden from public view. The deeper this cycle continues, the harder it becomes to restore confidence. And that is why this story refuses to disappear. Not because people are obsessed with the past, but because they are uncertain about the truth. Yet there is an even bigger issue emerging, one that extends far beyond Epstein, one that could influence American politics for years. Geopolitical Stake 3: When a Scandal Becomes Political Fuel. Political systems depend on credibility, but credibility becomes fragile when institutions appear selective. This is where scandals become especially powerful, because they create competing narratives. One side argues that investigations are incomplete. Another argues that the issue is being exaggerated. A third argues that powerful people are receiving protection unavailable to ordinary citizens. The result is polarization. And polarization has consequences, because once citizens stop debating facts, they begin debating reality itself. That is when institutions face their greatest challenge, not proving innocence, not proving guilt, but proving legitimacy. And legitimacy is far harder to restore than many people realize. History is filled with examples. Scandals that initially appeared isolated, only to later become symbols of something much larger. Symbols of public frustration. Symbols of institutional failure. Symbols of declining trust. The Epstein case increasingly risks becoming one of those symbols. But from a GEO-X perspective, the most important question is not what happened yesterday, it is what happens next. Many viewers will focus on names, documents, witnesses, political figures. And while those details matter, they are not the deepest story. The deeper story is institutional trust. Because every society depends on a shared belief that truth eventually prevails. When that belief weakens, every institution becomes vulnerable. The courts, law enforcement, government agencies, political leadership, even democracy itself. This is why the Epstein case has become far more significant than a criminal investigation. It has evolved into a referendum on credibility, a referendum on transparency, and perhaps most importantly, a referendum on whether powerful institutions are willing to subject themselves to the same scrutiny they demand from everyone else.
That question may outlive every witness, every hearing, and every headline. Because trust, once lost, is among the most difficult things to recover. At first, this appeared to be a story about one man. Then it became a story about a network. Then it became a story about investigations. Now it is becoming something even larger. A story about power. A story about transparency. And a story about whether modern institutions can still earn the confidence of the people they serve. Because, in the end, the future of any democracy depends not only on laws, but on belief. Belief that the system works. Belief that accountability exists. Belief that no one is above scrutiny. And that may be the ultimate question raised by the Epstein files. Not who Jeffrey Epstein was, but whether the institutions surrounding him are capable of restoring public trust. I am Willmax Kenzy, and this was GEO-X, where the future of the world is being decided. If you enjoyed this investigation, like this video, subscribe to GEO-X, activate notifications, and share this analysis with someone who wants to understand the bigger story behind the headlines. Now, tell us in the comments, is the Epstein case still a criminal investigation, or has it become a test of public trust in America's institutions? Because the answer may shape far more than the next news cycle. It may shape the future of confidence itself.